Part 1. Life was brutal in ancient Egypt. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight we begin with a trip down the Nile, or at least the Nile as it existed thousands of years ago, when life was less sunny vacation and more sunburn, scorpions, and bad plumbing. So dim the lights, maybe grab a lukewarm cup of tea, and settle in. We're about to float gently through the monotonous, dusty, and occasionally smelly corridors of ancient Egyptian life. Try to keep your eyelids heavy. This is going to be relaxing in that peculiar, your brain is slowly sinking into a mud bath kind of way. Now, when you think of ancient Egypt, it's easy to imagine golden pyramids, sphinxes with inscrutable expressions, and pharaohs draped in gold, probably humming to themselves because why not? But beneath the sparkle, life was, well, let's say it was challenging, if you prefer a euphemism over utterly exhausting and painful. Let's start with the basics. Most people lived in tiny mud brick houses that smelled vaguely of, let's call it river ambiance, which is just a polite way to say sewage. Their floors were dirt, their furniture was sticks, and their beds, if you could even call them that, were a sort of elevated plank that made every night a minor exercise in patience and back pain. You might imagine a modern Egyptian peasant or city dweller glancing back through time, squinting and saying, "Really? You had no heating? No running water? No IKEA?" But nope, you had the Nile, which was convenient for irrigation and convenient for the occasional disease outbreak because, again, river ambiance. Food was predictable. Bread, mostly, sometimes fish. If you were lucky, a bit of beer that doubled as hydration and a mild sedative, which, looking back, makes perfect sense. Ancient Egyptians were the original 1 cup of coffee to wake up, 1 cup of beer to forget it all society. There were vegetables too, but let's be honest, they were mostly onions and leeks. We'll revisit onions a lot because Egyptians loved onions like some people love designer shoes. A staple, a status symbol, and a flavor that sticks to your breath for days. Disease was another slow, steady companion. Parasites, dysentery, and the occasional plaguey river outbreak were all part of daily life. Dental hygiene? Non-existent. You see, their bread was full of grit from stone milling, which is basically teeth sanding. Imagine every bite of food giving you a subtle reminder of mortality. That's a kind of calm dread that pairs beautifully with bedtime storytelling. The pharaohs, of course, were supposed to be god kings, but let's not kid ourselves. Even they had quirks and issues. Take Pepi II, who apparently ruled for over 90 years. Imagine that, 9 decades of bureaucracy, sand, and complaints about the quality of mud brick. Pepi II's reign is famous, if slightly tedious, because it's a story of slow decay rather than heroic conquest. And he wasn't alone in being a long-lived, oddly beleaguered ruler. The dynasties were full of rulers who outlived their vitality and spent decades just being there, sitting, nodding, approving harvest records, occasionally staring at a slave and thinking, "Do you really need that many onions?" In fact, dynastic succession itself was a headache. Inbreeding was rampant because royalty liked keeping power inside the family, and nature had some subtle, cruel ways of pushing back. Children were sickly, people were short, some had prominent, slightly alarming facial features, which later historians described in ways like, "He looked like a half-baked Habsburg potato," though, of course, the Egyptians wouldn't have used those words. Imagine being born into privilege and still slowly wasting away from genetic quirks and malnutrition. It wasn't all gloom, of course. Religious rituals offered distractions. Every day, priests would wave incense, chant formulas, and occasionally carry out elaborate ceremonies that involved multiple stages, thousands of words, and a fair number of goats, or cows, or occasionally a duck, because why not? The average Egyptian might never see a temple ceremony up close, but they certainly felt the consequences: mandatory labor, corvée taxes, and occasional panic when the Nile didn't flood properly. Speaking of labor, let's talk construction. Pyramids. Not at all glamorous. Those magnificent monuments we all imagine as eternal wonders were, for the average laborer, basically endless shifts of hauling massive limestone blocks in intense sun, getting eaten by flies, and hoping not to be crushed. There were workers' villages near the pyramids, which archaeological evidence suggests were surprisingly organized, because if you're going to enslave people for decades, you might as well feed them properly and give them decent housing. They had bread, beer, onions, again, and plenty of mud to sleep on. That's probably the least exciting part of pyramid history, but it's soothing in a, hey, life was repetitive and tiresome way. Let's float over to another royal disaster. Akhenaten, sometimes called the heretic pharaoh, decided one day that Egypt needed a new religion, focused entirely on the sun disk Aten. It was less about spirituality and more about disrupting everything. He moved the capital to a new city that he named after himself because why not? And spent years changing art styles, worship practices, and general decorum. His wife, Nefertiti, was apparently quite striking, and their family portraits show elongated faces and oddly exaggerated features, probably a mix of artistic license and inbreeding side effects. Imagine being a servant in that court. Wait, are those people even human? And yet, despite these dynastic misadventures, Egyptian society had its moments of simple pedestrian charm. Farmers, artisans, and scribes developed techniques that were surprisingly clever: irrigation systems that diverted the floodwater, papyrus for writing, and a bureaucracy that could catalog livestock, grain, and workers with meticulous precision. It's oddly comforting to think that amidst the harshness of sun, sand, and onions, humans still found ways to keep records, write love notes, and measure the width of a cat. Daily life was punctuated by tiny comforts: a bit of beer, maybe a sunshade, and probably a pet monkey or a cat. Cats in particular were highly valued, partly for pest control, partly for status, and partly because, well, cats are cats. Imagine an ancient Egyptian cat knocking over your clay pot of beer, and your only response is, "Ah, good, at least the mouse won't get it." Children's lives were short and often grim. Infants were at risk from disease, accidents, and sometimes, sadly, malnutrition. Those who survived childhood often had to work from a young age, learning trades or helping in the fields. Play existed, of course, but it was brief. Knucklebones, small dolls, and simple games. Nothing like modern swings or playgrounds, more like roll this bone-shaped rock and hope it doesn't hit anyone. And for the elite, it was still not exactly easy. Pharaohs, princes, and high officials were pressured by tradition, ritual, and public expectation. They had advisors, but advisors were human and often as annoying as the rest of the population. Royal children grew up with tutors, political lessons, and the occasional freak accident involving a chariot, crocodile, or slightly unbalanced pyramid brick. And because lineage was everything, family squabbles were constant, bitter, and occasionally absurd. So, as we drift further down the Nile in our imagination, remember this: life was a mix of routine, ritual, and minor catastrophes. People ate, slept, and worked, often in ways that seem absurd to us. They built monuments that have outlasted empires, yet most of them probably would have just appreciated a comfortable mattress and fewer onions. We'll continue soon with more stories of pharaohs who had peculiar obsessions, princes who failed spectacularly at everything, and dynasties that somehow managed to survive despite, well, everything. For now, let your mind wander slowly along the river, letting the heat, dust, and monotony of ancient Egypt lull you towards sleep.
Part 2. Pharaohs, Dynasties, and Daily Disasters. Welcome back, friends. If you're still upright and breathing, that's good. Let's gently ease ourselves further into ancient Egyptian life. Specifically, the oddities, quirks, and sometimes utterly tedious disasters of pharaohs and their families. Imagine a royal court where every day involves paperwork, weird fashion choices, and subtle passive aggression across dynasties. Comfortable? Great. Let's float. We left off with the river, the onions, and the general exhaustion of daily life. Now let's meet some pharaohs who took this life is brutal philosophy to heart, or at least embodied it unknowingly for our bedtime amusement. First, there's Thutmose III, often called the Napoleon of Egypt, though honestly that comparison makes him sound far more energetic than he probably was. Thutmose spent most of his early years under the shadow of his stepmother, Hatshepsut, who was quite the ambitious woman. She declared herself pharaoh, which is already a little awkward for any stepson trying to enjoy a calm adolescence. Imagine living in a palace where your stepmom is officially more powerful than you and insists on having your name and titles removed from inscriptions. Every morning, Thutmose probably sipped his slightly gritty beer and muttered, "Why did I even get up today?" Hatshepsut herself is fascinating in a slow, lounge care kind of way. She liked to dress as a man, false beard and all, which in modern terms would be cross-dressing for political efficiency. She sponsored enormous temple projects, oversaw trade missions, and generally ran Egypt like a CEO who occasionally painted herself in gold. And yet, despite her power, her reign was calm in the sense that she didn't die in battle or succumb to political chaos. Eventually, Thutmose came of age, assumed power, and of course, tried to erase Hatshepsut's legacy. Because why not double down on family drama after decades of passive-aggressive palace tension? Then there's Akhenaten, the sun disk obsessive we briefly met. His religious reforms, focusing on Aten only, were so radical that they disrupted the usual slow, predictable rhythm of Egyptian life. Temples went empty. Priests had to retrain. The art changed dramatically, featuring elongated limbs and faces, which archaeologists now lovingly describe as extraordinarily peculiar, but somehow elegant. In practical terms, his family life was a mix of strange aesthetics and political necessity. Akhenaten's wife, Nefertiti, seems to have been as competent as she was beautiful, which is probably why she appears in so many reliefs, often towering over officials. Imagine being a royal official and having Nefertiti glare at you because your paperwork was late. It's enough to induce chronic existential boredom. Akhenaten also had a son, Tutankhamun, the famous King Tut. You know him mostly because of the glittery tomb, but his life was, in reality, a gentle series of medical annoyances and political constraints. Poor Tutankhamun inherited the throne as a child, which is one way to guarantee a lifetime of mild panic and court intrigue. His dental problems, clubfoot, and other ailments suggest that royal inbreeding was catching up to him. He ruled quietly, then died young, surprising nobody who understood dynastic biology. His tomb's treasure was fabulous, but the boy himself probably would have preferred a simple nap, fewer sandals, and maybe a bit less ceremonial duty. While these pharaohs were occupied with ideology, health issues, and family tension, ordinary Egyptians continued the daily grind. Farmers plodded through hot fields, artisans chiseled at stone monuments, and scribes cataloged livestock with the same unhurried precision as they had for centuries. In fact, the bureaucracy was probably the most reliably boring aspect of Egyptian life. Records, tax rolls, and harvest counts day in, day out. If you were a scribe, your life was mostly wake up, ink some papyrus, sigh, and repeat. Comforting monotony, really. Speaking of monotony, let's examine royal marriages, which were a subtle mix of strategy, inbreeding, and mild tragedy. Marriages between siblings, cousins, and occasionally slightly more distant relatives were common. The goal was to preserve the divine bloodline, but the side effects were noticeable. Some royals had pronounced physical features, chronic illness, or other quirks that historians now trace to this familial practice. Children often faced significant health challenges, and yet the cycle persisted because tradition is stubborn and dynasties are committed to doing things exactly as their ancestors did. Consider Amenhotep III, who ruled at the height of Egypt's wealth. He was surrounded by luxury, artisans, and beautiful women, but even he had quirks. He commissioned statues of himself so large that they were cumbersome and expensive to move. He threw enormous festivals, probably to distract people from the slightly problematic flooding patterns, and yet, despite all this pomp, his family life was delicate. Multiple wives, many children, and the usual pressure to maintain a flawless public image made daily life a careful negotiation of favors, food, and fine linens. You can almost hear the mental whisper of, "Why am I awake? There's so much paperwork." Even the pyramids didn't make life less mundane. Most of the laborers were not slaves, contrary to popular belief, but conscripted workers. They received rations of bread, beer, onions, and occasionally fish. These rations were designed to keep them alive and functioning, not to inspire joy. And yet, there was some comfort in routine. Build a wall, haul a block, eat a stale onion, repeat. Monotony as a survival tactic. We also have the smaller, quieter tragedies. Infant mortality was high, illnesses were chronic and largely untreatable. Dental issues plagued nearly everyone. Life expectancy hovered in the 30s or 40s, with only the luckiest surviving beyond. Emotional life was constrained by social hierarchy and duty. A craftsman or farmer might find brief amusement in festivals or a stray cat, but mostly, life was about endurance. And perhaps that's the key to understanding Egypt. Endurance, persistence, and a gentle acceptance that some days are slightly better than others, but most are merely okay enough. Let's drift briefly into artistic quirks. Egyptians were obsessed with symmetry and symbolism. Men were shown with darker skin, women lighter, for reasons historians theorize were both symbolic and literal. Gods and goddesses were part human, part animal, which gave them a slightly surreal air. And yet the art was mostly functional, decorating tombs, inspiring awe, or gently reminding you of mortality. Pharaohs might be portrayed as eternally youthful, but in reality, they had the same slow march toward decay as anyone else. As we continue floating down this historical current, imagine palace intrigues as a slow, sleepy dance. Princes squabble over titles, while priests whisper the proper chants. Farmers curse the sun as they toil. Artisans tap chisels in repetitive rhythms, and scribes sigh over the endless lists of grain. Monotony was universal, whether you wore gold or mud, and in some strange, meditative way, that monotony is comforting. Finally, before we gently drift into our next segment, remember that Egypt's history is a study of contrasts, monumental ambition versus daily tedium, and the occasional glittery tomb hiding decades of routine, illness, and paperwork. The people of the Nile were remarkably resilient, and their stories, while not always thrilling, offer a calm, continuous hum of life, a hum perfect for bedtime.
Part 3. Royal children, inbreeding, and minor disasters. Welcome back, drifting historians. If you're still with me, congratulations. You've successfully traversed mud brick homes, onions, slightly terrifying pharaohs, and mildly upsetting labor routines. Now let's settle in for a look at the younger generation, royal children. Because even in ancient Egypt, childhood wasn't exactly a carefree time of finger painting and naps. First, it's important to understand that being a pharaoh's child came with perks. Fine clothes, tutors, access to ceremonial gold, and a permanent seat in dynastic paperwork. But perks came with obligations. Most royal children were part of a careful genetic experiment stretching back generations.
You've probably heard the rumors about Egyptian inbreeding, and they're mostly true. Brothers married sisters, cousins intermarried, and occasionally a very enthusiastic uncle would join the mix. The idea was to preserve divine blood, which is a nice way of saying we value weird facial features and genetic quirks over basic health. One example is Tutankhamun, the boy king we met earlier. He inherited not only the throne, but also a long list of health problems likely caused by generations of close relative marriage. Clubfoot, a cleft palate, and dental issues marked his short life, yet he still had a glittering tomb centuries later. It's comforting, in a slow, bedtime sort of way, to think that even tiny pharaohs had monumental paperwork and glittery chaos waiting for them. Then there's Akhenaten's family, which was unusual, to say the least. His elongated art style makes the whole household look slightly alien. His 6 daughters, born in succession, seem to have grown up in constant observation, likely receiving lessons in ritual, etiquette, and how to pose for reliefs that exaggerated their features. Can you imagine a childhood where every pout and smile is catalogued by a court artist? And yet, in some quiet, repetitive way, it's the perfect sleepy meditation on human peculiarity. Royal children often faced the slow, grinding reality of succession anxiety. If you weren't first in line, or if you had minor health issues, life could be dully stressful. Princes and princesses might spend decades quietly studying paperwork, learning to read hieroglyphs, and observing rituals that lasted hours. They were taught military drills that they might never use, and ceremonial dances for gods they might never meet. Essentially, they were enrolled in the slowest, most exhausting boarding school imaginable. Let's float over to the Ptolemaic dynasty, centuries later, but still part of Egypt's sleepy river history. These rulers were famous for sibling marriages, producing a long line of heirs who were often frail or eccentric. Cleopatra VII, the famous Cleopatra, was a product of this system, and likely witnessed generations of minor genetic quirks firsthand. Her family life was complex. Siblings married one another, power struggles simmered quietly, and childhood must have involved an endless repetition of ceremonial duties and cautious observation of who could be trusted. Imagine trying to nap while your sibling plots political subtlety next to your bed. And yet, in some quiet, repetitive way, it's the perfect sleepy meditation on human peculiarity. Now, a word about royal habits that were peculiar. Pharaohs and their children often developed odd routines, compulsive washing, extreme dietary preferences, or fascination with certain animals. Cats were adored, of course, but monkeys, birds, and occasional exotic pets became constant companions in palaces. Picture a toddler prince gently cradling a monkey while also learning to chant sacred hymns. It's simultaneously endearing and slightly exhausting just to think about. Minor injuries and illnesses were routine. Broken bones from chariot practice, fevers from the Nile's mosquito population, and digestive troubles from unusual royal diets were all part of growing up in a palace. The medical practices of the time were, well, let's say they leaned heavily on herbs, spells, and ritual incantations. A royal child might be swaddled, prayed over, and given herbal pastes that smelled vaguely like onions. Imagine a sleepy, back-and-forth routine. Eat, chant, nap, repeat. Comforting in its predictability, even if not particularly effective. Education was slow, deliberate, and slightly oppressive.
Tutors drilled hieroglyphs, arithmetic for managing estates, and ritual protocol. Most royal children could recite genealogies perfectly, which is impressive if you're 5 and deeply boring if you're 8. Fun, however, sometimes appeared in the form of board games, small toys, and occasional excursions along the Nile, though nothing too exciting. Maybe a boat ride past papyrus reeds, the sun glinting off mud brick walls, and the occasional goat wandering by. Calm, rhythmic, predictable. Family politics added another layer of mild chaos. Cousins, uncles, and aunts were always negotiating minor advantages. One sibling might be designated heir, but later demoted. Another might inherit ceremonial roles with long lists of obligations and nothing exciting to actually do. Growing up in such an environment required patience, careful observation, and the ability to nap at odd hours, which, now that I think about it, sounds oddly like the perfect preparation for modern life. Let's briefly consider royal funerals, which were both spectacular and mundane. Children, especially heirs, were expected to participate in rituals, learn the proper chants, and observe ceremonial procedures that lasted hours. It was impressive, yes, but also repetitive. Imagine practicing a long, slow procession day after day, only to repeat it at the actual funeral. The repetition, monotony, and mild ceremonial panic formed a significant portion of a royal child's experience. Despite the challenges, some children thrived, or at least endured. They learned to balance the absurdity of palace rituals, the minor physical discomforts, and the subtle politics that pervaded every moment. They developed an uncanny ability to remain calm while navigating repetitive chores, ceremonial dances, and familial expectations. And maybe that's the quiet lesson of Egyptian childhood. Endurance, patience, and the slow rhythm of days that are mostly fine, with occasional mild disturbances. And finally, as we let our minds drift gently through these royal corridors, imagine the palace interiors, muted sunlight filtering through lattice windows, scribes cataloguing livestock in the courtyard, children practicing chants, and cats sauntering along mud brick walls. Every sound, every smell, every repetitive task contributes to a gentle hum of life, a hum perfect for bedtime contemplation.
Part 4. Eccentric Rulers and Dynastic Oddities. Welcome back, gentle historians. If your eyes are fluttering but your curiosity is still present, perfect. Let's drift through the quieter, slightly absurd side of adult life in ancient Egypt's palaces. The eccentricities, the rituals, and the minor disasters of rulers who ruled not with dramatic heroics, but with steady, occasionally bewildering quirkiness. Take Ramses II, sometimes called Ramses the Great. He ruled for over 66 years, which is a long time. Very long. Imagine spending 6 decades in charge of a kingdom where daily life involved paperwork, taxes, temple inspections, and occasional construction projects. Even for a pharaoh, that is a lot of repetition. He did have a reputation for being ambitious, commissioning colossal statues and temples, but most of his life must have been a slow parade of ceremonial routines, banquets, and political nudges. And yes, he had many wives and children, but that's more paperwork than romance. Think of it as a life spent managing logistics while everyone admired your colossal stone head. Ramses' father, Seti I, was equally methodical, but less showy. A steady administrative type, he ensured that Egypt's bureaucracy functioned like a slightly slow but reliable river current. You can imagine Seti pacing palace corridors, nodding approvingly at scribes, occasionally sighing over minor miscalculations in grain inventories, and wondering if anyone had checked the onions yet.
And then there's Cleopatra VII, whose fame sometimes makes us forget that her life was riddled with minor frustrations and slow-moving crises. She had to negotiate with Roman politicians, navigate sibling rivalries, and manage her image meticulously. Every gesture, every public appearance, every conversation was part of a careful balancing act. Cleopatra's daily life included ruling a kingdom, managing familial disputes, and probably wondering why no one made better bread. Royal eccentricities were not just political. Pharaohs often developed unusual habits, possibly due to wealth, boredom, or subtle psychological stress. Some wore heavy jewelry at all times, not for fashion, but to signal divine authority. Others insisted on strict diets or repetitive routines that served no practical purpose other than comfort. Akhenaten, for instance, obsessed over sun worship and the aesthetics of his family, leading to artwork so stylized that modern viewers think, did they actually look like this? Perhaps not. Perhaps it was just another layer of gentle absurdity in palace life. Palaces themselves were fascinatingly mundane in daily operation. Servants moved in predictable patterns, food preparation followed exact routines, and ceremonies repeated endlessly. Even monumental events like temple dedications were in practice long, repetitive, and exhausting affairs. Think of endless chants, ritual offerings, and mild excitement over minor procedural correctness. It's a quiet kind of chaos, perfect for meditation or sleep. Dynastic misadventures added another layer of subtle intrigue. Succession disputes were common, with siblings quietly maneuvering for position. Marriages within the family preserved status, but often produced heirs with chronic ailments or peculiar appearances. Children, as we've seen, grew up in a carefully controlled environment, learning ritual, etiquette, and patience, the slow cultivation of endurance. And adults, even with power, faced daily pressures that were more dull than dramatic, managing estates, inspecting construction, or attending repetitive ceremonies. Let's briefly visit Susenes I, a ruler whose tomb gives us a window into palace life. His remains were found in elaborate burial attire, surrounded by treasures, suggesting a concern for comfort in the afterlife that mirrored daily life. His reign appears uneventful, which is, in this context, almost delightful. An uneventful reign meant fewer crises, fewer political headaches, and plenty of quiet time for ceremonial observation. A life of mild monotony, punctuated by occasional minor excitement. And then there's the story of Sneferu, the pyramid builder. He commissioned multiple pyramids, each slightly imperfect compared to the last. Perhaps he was striving for perfection, or perhaps he simply liked repetitive tasks. Either way, the process of building pyramids, dragging stones, supervising laborers, and approving blueprints was probably the Egyptian equivalent of slow, calming office work, but with more sun and dust. One imagines Sneferu occasionally rubbing his temples, wondering if the next pyramid would finally meet his exacting standards, and then napping under the shade of a papyrus tree. Even minor rulers, obscure princes, or regional governors had lives filled with repetitive responsibilities. Administering a nome, a province, involved cataloging crops, collecting taxes, attending ceremonial functions, and gently supervising labor. These small methodical tasks dominated daily life, and while not dramatic, they were essential to the continuity of society. The quiet, steady rhythms of administration are perhaps the most soothing part of ancient Egyptian history, if one prefers a story that hums softly rather than shouts. We should also note the subtle tragedies of elite households. Wives of pharaohs, though privileged, lived lives of careful observation. They managed children, supervised servants, attended rituals, and navigated the delicate politics of palace life. A single misstep in protocol could have minor social repercussions. It's hard to imagine, but even power came with mild tedium, strict schedules, and the occasional frustration over unfinished temple projects. Religion, of course, threaded through every moment. Daily prayers, temple inspections, and ritual offerings were ubiquitous. Pharaohs might personally oversee these acts or delegate to priests, but the repetition was constant.
Gods demanded attention, and humans, no matter how powerful, had to comply. This slow, ritualized life is strangely soothing to picture. Predictable, cyclic, and punctuated by minor ceremonial flourishes rather than sudden chaos. Finally, let's return to the overarching theme. Life was harsh, but also strangely rhythmic. Adults and children alike endured repetitive work, minor ailments, strict dietary rules, and endless ceremonial obligations. Yet they persisted, adapted, and sometimes found comfort in routine, pets, or small pleasures like a well-baked loaf of bread or a brief boat ride along the Nile. For all its grandeur, ancient Egyptian history is a slow, deliberate flow. A gentle current carrying humans through mundane brilliance, minor quirks, and occasional aesthetic oddities. As we let our minds wander along mud-brick corridors, sunlit courtyards, and ceremonial halls, remember, life was not glamorous. It was slow, repetitive, and slightly absurd, with minor frustrations balanced by routine and occasional ritual beauty. Perfect material for a calm, drifting meditation before sleep.
Part 5. Funerals, Art, and Life for the Rest of Us. Welcome back, gentle historians. If you're still upright, that's great, but don't worry, this next stretch is even more soothing. We're leaving the palace intrigues and eccentric rulers for a moment to float through funerals, artistic conventions, and the quietly repetitive life of ordinary Egyptians. Let's begin with funerals. Ancient Egyptians had an obsession with the afterlife that was methodical. Elaborate rituals, mummification, and intricate tombs consumed countless hours of effort. Pharaohs and elites were preserved meticulously, wrapped in linen, adorned with jewelry, and laid to rest with food, tools, and occasionally pets. It's a fascinating mixture of ceremony and minor inconvenience. Imagine being a servant tasked with wrapping a body for days in layers of linen while chanting prayers in a slightly monotone rhythm. Not dangerous, not dramatic, just slow, careful, and repetitive. Perfect for a sleepy mind. Mummification itself was extensive. Embalming fluid, removal of organs, drying, wrapping, and decoration took weeks. Priests performed each step with exacting precision, often chanting incantations that repeated daily. For them, life probably consisted of wake up, chant, wrap, chant, sit beer, repeat. And yet, it was this slow, methodical work that allowed us to glimpse the past in such detail today. It's oddly comforting. People long ago doing small, exacting tasks with patient attention. Art in ancient Egypt also reflected routine. Wall reliefs, statues, and paintings followed strict conventions. Men were often depicted darker, women lighter. Figures were arranged in rigid poses. Perspective was mostly ignored. Pharaohs were shown youthful and idealized, while ordinary people were more realistically portrayed. The rules were repetitive, the style consistent, and the overall effect mildly hypnotic. Imagine a craftsman slowly carving the same hieroglyphs day after day, perfecting each line. It's not exciting, but it has a calming rhythm. Now let's visit the laborers, the backbone of Egypt's daily life. These were the farmers, artisans, builders, and scribes who made civilization hum along. Farmers spent their days plowing fields, planting seeds, and waiting for the Nile's predictable flood cycle. The rhythm of sowing, watering, harvesting, and storing crops was slow and repetitive, but it worked. Artisans labored in workshops, carving stone, making pottery, or producing jewelry for the elite. Scribes meticulously recorded inventories, taxes, and legal contracts. Their lives were dull on the surface, but in that dullness was a kind of quiet continuity. Food for most Egyptians was simple and repetitive. Bread, beer, onions, and occasionally fish dominated meals. Luxury was rare, but small pleasures existed. a fresh loaf, a rare vegetable, or a small festival offering. Cats roamed courtyards, monkeys occasionally entertained, and the river provided both work and leisure. The average person's life was not exciting, but it was stable, predictable, slow, and perfect for drifting toward a meditative state. Even leisure was gentle and repetitive. Board games, simple toys, small festivals, and casual music offered minor enjoyment without risk or drama. A day in the life of a worker might be rise, eat bread, work in fields or workshops, observe ritual from a distance, sip beer, eat dinner, sleep. Calm, methodical, rhythmic. Returning briefly to funerals, ordinary Egyptians also practiced careful burial rituals, not as lavish as the pharaohs, but thoughtful. Graves included basic necessities, food, small tools, personal items. The process was slow, respectful, and repeated consistently across generations. Mourners performed chants, organized offerings, and observed rituals with a quiet dedication. There was no rush, no dramatic gestures, just calm, deliberate attention to what was important. Artifacts from this period show us a world of subtle, repeated patterns. Repetitive pottery designs, predictable hieroglyphs, and standardized temple layouts. Even monumental constructions like pyramids, obelisks, and temples reflect this slow, deliberate rhythm. Builders and planners measured twice, cut once, moved blocks slowly, and repeated the process thousands of times. It's easy to see how the repetitive nature of work, ritual, and art could lull both workers and observers into a meditative, sleepy rhythm. Finally, consider the rhythm of time in Egypt. Days flowed according to the sun, months according to the Nile's rise and fall, and years measured by agricultural cycles. Life, for most, was a gentle, predictable loop of labor, ritual, and occasional minor delight. Pharaohs and nobles had their minor eccentricities, children had repetitive lessons and ceremonial duties, and ordinary Egyptians had the reassuring monotony of daily labor. Across the social spectrum, existence was structured, methodical, and oddly comforting when viewed as a slow-flowing current. So, as we drift along the Nile in our imagination, picture mud brick homes glowing in early morning light, the soft chant of priests in distant temples, scribes writing patiently, children learning gentle lessons, and cats slipping silently along sun-warmed walls. Life was, for all its hardships, slow, repetitive, and predictably human. And in that predictability, perhaps there is a kind of sleepy beauty, a calm, flowing continuity that invites our own minds to drift and rest.
Part 6. Religion, Festivals, and Bureaucratic Flow. Welcome back, gentle historians. By now, your mind might be drifting along like a small papyrus boat on the Nile, which is perfect. Let's explore the quieter, strangely soothing aspects of religion, festivals, and the endless hum of bureaucracy that defined ancient Egyptian life. Religion permeated everything. Pharaohs were divine intermediaries, priests were meticulous functionaries, and ordinary people participated in rituals ranging from simple prayers to complex temple ceremonies. Every day had a religious rhythm, offerings, chants, and small acts of devotion. The repetitive nature of these rituals, combined with incense, chanting, and gentle ceremonial movements, created a calm, predictable structure. For the average person, it was a slow, steady flow of tiny obligations, perfect for meditative contemplation, or, in our case, sleepy narration. Temple life was structured and repetitive. Priests followed exact schedules, offering food, water, and incense to statues of gods. Rituals often involved multiple stages repeated daily, weekly, or seasonally. Imagine a priest in a cool stone chamber. Rise, chant, sprinkle water, wave incense, record the procedure, take a sip of beer, repeat. Years of quiet repetition might seem monotonous, but for the Egyptians it maintained cosmic order, ma'at, the balance of the universe. Predictable, rhythmic, essential, and gently hypnotic. Festivals provided occasional variation, though not necessarily excitement as we might define it. There were processions, ceremonial dances, and offerings, all occurring on a slow, deliberate schedule. People might gather, chant, and observe priests, but there were no pyrotechnics, no sudden surprises, just a gentle flow of communal ritual. For laborers and artisans, festivals offered a welcome pause from labor and a slight change in daily routine, punctuated by music, food, and mild socializing. Even then, the pace was slow. Flow to statue, chant a hymn, present offerings, return to work. Pharaohs participated in festivals as well, though for them it was more ceremonial than recreational. They processed through temples, observed rituals, and ensured that gods were properly honored. Even great rulers like Ramses II, who liked colossal statues, still followed repetitive ceremonial schedules. Their lives were a balance of power, ritual, and deliberate observation. No drama required, just slow, meticulous maintenance of cosmic and social order. Now let's gently consider bureaucracy. Ancient Egypt had one of the world's most methodical administrative systems. Scribes documented crop yields, labor assignments, taxation, and temple offerings with calm, steady precision. Their days involved long hours of recording, calculating, and archiving. Mistakes were rare because of careful repetition, and errors were usually small, like miscounting a loaf of bread or a dozen onions. The work was dull, reliable, and essential, creating a rhythm that sustained society for centuries. There's a soothing quality to imagining a scribe meticulously copying numbers into a papyrus ledger, the sun streaming in, the Nile flowing outside. Even the court itself followed subtle, repetitive rules. Diplomacy was slow and deliberate. Letters were written carefully, envoys traveled slowly, and minor disputes were negotiated in a predictable cycle. Pharaohs did not rush, they observed, nodded, and occasionally delegated. The repetition and gentle predictability made the life of a ruler strangely meditative, punctuated by minor frustrations, ceremonial duties, and occasional satisfaction at a well-executed ritual. Religious festivals sometimes involved processions along the Nile. Boats carrying statues of gods floated slowly downstream, accompanied by chanting, music, and ritual offerings. People lined the banks, watching, participating, and maintaining order. There were no dramatic battles or sudden upheavals, just a steady, hypnotic flow of ceremonial action. It was social, public, and repetitive, a slow-moving celebration that reinforced community, faith, and cosmic stability. Even the less glamorous aspects of religion followed rhythm. Mortuary priests recited formulas, performed offerings, and inspected tunes. Farmers made small offerings to household gods for protection and harvest success. Artisans added religious symbols to daily work. Life, in all its quiet repetition, revolved around these subtle currents of faith. Finally, consider the effect on ordinary people. Laborers, artisans, and scribes moved through a world where ritual, work, and seasonal cycles were predictable. Days flowed according to the sun, months according to the Nile's rise, and years according to agricultural cycles. Children learned ceremonies, adults performed work and offerings, and everyone participated in a gentle continuity that spanned generations. The pace was slow, the rhythm steady, and the world, despite hardships, reliably structured. So, as we drift along, imagine the slow beat of ceremonial life. Incense curling upward, priests chanting softly, scribes recording totals, children repeating rituals, and boats floating downstream in processions. Life was calm, repetitive, and sometimes odd, but always continuous. The hum of daily activity, ceremonial order, and predictable labor forms a lullaby of civilization itself, a gentle current to ease the mind and soothe the imagination.
Part 7. Health, Diet, and Domestic Rhythms. Welcome back, patient historians. If your eyelids are starting to feel pleasantly heavy, perfect. Tonight we continue our gentle drift through ancient Egyptian life, this time focusing on the slow, deliberate realities of health, diet, and domestic routines. It's not exciting, but it is calm, repetitive, and strangely hypnotic, perfect for a sleepy mind. Let's start with health. Ancient Egyptians, like most pre-modern societies, faced constant, low-level threats to their well-being. Disease was common, from parasites in the Nile to dysentery and respiratory infections caused by dust and smoke. Dental issues were widespread. Remember that gritty bread? Stone ground flour produced tiny shards that wore down teeth, sometimes leaving painful cavities or broken molars. For most people, this was a daily, dull discomfort. Not dramatic, just slightly irritating. A persistent reminder that life, even in golden sand, demanded endurance. Royalty, of course, were not exempt. Children of pharaohs often inherited genetic quirks due to inbreeding, leading to fragile bones, dental problems, or other chronic conditions. Adult rulers managed minor ailments while continuing ceremonial duties, writing correspondence, and overseeing vast estates. Even the great Ramses II probably experienced a dull ache or stiff joint from decades of standing, reviewing monuments, or supervising temple construction. Pain was steady, predictable, and rarely sensational. Diet shaped life quietly but consistently. Bread, onions, and beer dominated the average person's meals. Vegetables like leeks or garlic occasionally appeared, and fish from the Nile supplemented protein intake. Meat was rare, mostly for festivals or elite households. Luxury foods existed, honey, dates, figs, but were not everyday fare. Meals were predictable, repetitive, and sufficient to maintain energy for labor, ritual, and routine. The subtle monotony of diet contributed to the steady rhythm of life. Domestic routines were equally repetitive. Mud brick houses offered shelter, but floors were dirt and furniture was minimal. Low stools, mats for sleeping, and occasionally a simple table. Families performed chores slowly, cooking over clay hearths, fetching water from the Nile or wells, cleaning floors, and maintaining tools. Laundry involved scrubbing textiles, drying them in the sun, and repeating the process with remarkable patience. Even minor domestic crises, spilled beer, broken clay pots, or a goat wandering into the courtyard, were absorbed into daily rhythm rather than producing dramatic upheaval. Children in ordinary households learned early about labor, ritual, and social order. Play existed, but it was simple. Knucklebones, dolls, and small games designed to reinforce coordination and patience. Work, however, dominated childhood, helping in fields, assisting with chores, or observing religious rituals. The repetition of these activities built endurance, familiarity, and a gentle understanding of the world's slow rhythms.
For artisans, life was a slow, measured dance of precision and repetition. Stone carvers chipped away at monuments. Potters shaped clay into predictable forms, and scribes recorded the day's accounts. Minor errors were corrected methodically. Hours passed quietly, and accomplishments accumulated gradually. There was no rush, no drama, just steady, deliberate progress, perfect for calming the mind and aligning with the meditative flow of history. Even minor illnesses or domestic accidents were predictable. Scratches from stone, sunburn, insect bites, and minor fevers were handled with herbs, poultices, or gentle prayers. Treatments were repetitive. Apply ointment, recite formula, rest, repeat. Serious illness was rare in the sense of sudden catastrophe. It tended to be slow, drawn out, and quietly disruptive, rather than shocking. And yet, amidst these steady challenges, there were small, calming pleasures. The sound of the Nile flowing, birds calling in the morning, or the soft meow of a cat wandering a courtyard provided tiny reliefs. Food, while repetitive, offered comfort in its consistency. Religious observances created a gentle structure to the week and month. Labor, while demanding, created a predictable routine that anchored life. The world moved slowly, deliberately, and without sudden jolts, perfect for lulling the mind into gentle observation. Even among elites, domestic life had its rhythms. Pharaohs and officials rose early, observed ceremonial routines, received visitors, supervised estates, and rested mid-afternoon. Meals were structured. Attendants performed repetitive chores, and pets or decorative animals added minor, comforting distractions. Palace life, while privileged, was also filled with routine. Letters, reports, ceremonial inspections, and quietly ongoing political maneuvering. Nothing shocking, just steady maintenance of authority and structure. So as we float gently through mud brick homes, temple courtyards, and palace halls, imagine the slow heartbeat of Egypt. Children learning rituals, artisans shaping stone, farmers tending fields, priests chanting in calm, repeated sequences, and ordinary families completing domestic chores. Life was steady, predictable, and punctuated by small, repetitive joys and minor annoyances. Perfect for imagining, reflecting, and slowly drifting toward sleep.
Part 8. Leisure, Entertainment, and Festival Rhythms. Welcome back, patient historians. If your eyes are drooping, but your mind is still curious, perfect. Let's float through the quieter pleasures of ancient Egyptian life. Leisure, entertainment, and the slow-moving festivals that punctuated the otherwise repetitive days. Even in a society dominated by labor, ritual, and bureaucracy, people found ways to relax. Leisure for ordinary Egyptians was subtle, slow, and mostly repetitive. Children played with simple toys like knucklebones, dolls, and small wooden animals. Adults might enjoy gentle music from flutes or harps during downtime, or small games like senet, a board game involving strategy and luck. Nothing flashy, nothing fast-paced, just measured, calming, and predictable. Perfect for easing the mind toward a relaxed state. Pets were another source of quiet comfort. Cats were revered, wandering freely through homes and courtyards. Monkeys, dogs, and occasional birds added variety to daily life. Pharaohs and nobles often had exotic pets, but even ordinary households kept animals that provided companionship, minor amusement, and the occasional playful distraction. Imagine a cat lazily swatting at a rolling ball while a scribe slowly copies hieroglyphs nearby. Peaceful, methodical, and slightly charming. Festivals offered a gentle variation from routine, but still followed a deliberate, predictable structure. There were processions along the Nile, ceremonial dances, and ritual offerings to gods. Crowds gathered, songs were sung, and statues were paraded through streets and waterways. Yet, for the most part, festivals were calm, rhythmic, and repetitive. Everyone knew the steps: float the statue, chant the hymn, present offerings, and return home. Minor excitement, yes, but no surprises. Just the slow pulse of tradition. Food and drink played a role in festivals, offering small indulgences amid predictable routines. Special bread, honey, figs, and beer were distributed to participants. Everyone partook, smiled politely, and returned to daily life, slightly refreshed. It was a low-key celebration, without the urgency or chaos of modern festivals, emphasizing continuity and gentle enjoyment, rather than spectacle. Art, music, and storytelling also contributed to leisure. Wall paintings depicted stories in orderly sequences, craftsmen carved predictable reliefs, and musicians played soft tunes for temple or domestic enjoyment. Storytelling was deliberate and calm, recounting myths, genealogies, or moral tales. The narrative was slow, often repetitive, and gently instructive, a lullaby of history in visual and auditory form. Even minor competitions had a subdued rhythm. Boat races along the Nile, athletic exercises, or skill contests were usually slow and ceremonial. Observers cheered quietly, participants maintained measured pace, and the event concluded without drama. Participation reinforced social bonds and rhythm rather than excitement. Life, even in play, was deliberate, steady, and predictable. For pharaohs and elites, leisure also included observation and supervision. They might sit in shaded courtyards, review reports, or enjoy music while servants prepared food and pets wandered nearby. Reading, writing, and contemplating rituals were themselves leisure activities, gentle and structured. Even in moments of rest, the pulse of ceremonial life was present, reinforcing continuity and calm. The hum of daily life, chanting priests, flowing Nile, drifting boats, and quietly observant citizens created a landscape of calm monotony. As we let our imagination drift through sunlit courtyards, temple halls, and village streets, picture the subtle joys: children quietly playing, artisans calmly crafting, pets wandering, music gently echoing, and the slow procession of festival floats along the Nile. Life was repetitive, orderly, and mildly whimsical.
Part 9. Death, Tombs, and the Gentle Art of Remembering. Welcome back, calm historians. If your eyelids are heavy and your mind is wandering slowly like a boat along the Nile, perfect. Tonight, we drift into the quieter, repetitive, and surprisingly meditative world of death rituals, tomb building, and memorializing the dead in ancient Egypt. Death was never dramatic, at least not in the sense of sudden surprises for most people. It was anticipated, ritualized, and incorporated into daily life through religious observances, art, and tradition. For the elites, preparation began long before actual passing. Tombs were constructed carefully, often over decades, following precise architectural patterns and ceremonial requirements. Each block, each carving, each hieroglyph was placed with steady, deliberate repetition. Imagine the slow cadence of artisans at work, chiseling reliefs, smoothing stone, and occasionally sipping a bit of beer to maintain focus. Calm, hypnotic, and perfectly procedural. Mummification, as we've lightly touched on before, was also a slow, methodical process. Priests performed each step with meticulous attention, removing organs, drying the body, wrapping layers of linen, applying oils and resins, and chanting rituals in measured sequences. Every stage followed tradition, ensuring the deceased would transition properly into the afterlife. There was no drama, only repetition, precision, and ceremonial observation. Tombs themselves varied from modest burial sites for common citizens to grand pyramids and elaborate mortuary temples for pharaohs. The interiors were filled with items for daily life in the afterworld: tools, food, jewelry, and occasionally small pets. This preparation was gentle, methodical, and reassuring, ensuring the deceased would have everything necessary without the chaos of improvisation. The effort was a slow, deliberate meditation on mortality and continuity. The act of memorializing the dead was repetitive but comforting. Family members performed offerings, recited prayers, and observed rituals at regular intervals. The cyclical nature of these observances, daily, weekly, or yearly, created a predictable rhythm that reinforced both social bonds and cosmic order. Imagine generations of descendants quietly bringing bread, beer, or flowers to the tomb, performing the same gentle actions that ancestors had carried out centuries before. Steady, calm, unhurried. Art within tombs followed the same deliberate conventions seen in temples and public spaces. Figures were arranged predictably, hieroglyphs flowed in measured sequences, and symbols were repeated across walls. Scenes depicted daily activities, religious rituals, and afterlife expectations. For the artisan, each wall was a canvas of slow repetition. For the viewer, it was a meditation on life, death, and continuity. The rhythm of carving, painting, and arranging was soothing in its predictability. Even funerals themselves were methodical. Processions moved slowly from homes to burial sites, priests recited chants, mourners offered food, and the body was laid to rest according to strict ritual. There was little urgency, no sudden outbursts, just a continuous, gentle observance. The pace allowed participants to reflect, observe, and process the transition without chaos or distraction. For ordinary Egyptians, death rituals were scaled to means, but equally structured. Graves were prepared with modest goods, inscriptions were carved slowly, and families participated in repeated offerings. Life and death were intertwined through ritual, repetition, and slow preparation. Death was not a dramatic cliffhanger, but a continuation of the predictable rhythm of existence. Pharaohs and nobles, despite grandeur, followed the same calm principles. The goal was continuity, ensuring cosmic order, preserving memory, and honoring tradition. Tombs, pyramids, and mortuary temples were less about spectacle and more about slow, exacting attention to detail, sustained over years or decades. Workers, artisans, and priests all contributed to a long-term rhythm that outlasted generations, quietly linking past, present, and future.
Even in minor domestic contexts, death influenced rhythm. Families regularly observed small rituals for ancestors, maintained tombs, and passed down knowledge of preparation and ritual. Children learned gentle repetition through observation, bringing offerings, reciting prayers, and participating in minor ceremonies. The practice reinforced endurance, patience, and a sense of slow continuity. Finally, as we drift through the quiet corridors of tombs, imagine the slow meditative hum of ancient Egypt. Artisans chiseling hieroglyphs, priests chanting softly, relatives performing offerings, and the gentle flow of the Nile outside. Life, death, and memory were intertwined in a predictable, soothing rhythm. Repetition, ritual, and continuity formed a landscape of calm, minor eccentricity, and quiet reflection, a perfect setting for gentle meditation and eventual sleep.
Part 10. Seasons, Agriculture, and the Gentle Flow of Everyday Life. Welcome, patient historians, to the final stretch of our slow drift down the Nile. By now, your mind might be gently floating, which is exactly what we're aiming for. Let's settle into the quiet, rhythmic life of seasonal cycles, agriculture, and the everyday work that sustained ancient Egypt. The Nile's flooding dictated life with almost hypnotic regularity. Each year, farmers awaited the inundation, a slow swell of water carrying fertile silt to fields. Life revolved around this predictable pulse, planting, tending, harvesting, and storing crops. The rhythm was calming in its certainty. Work followed natural cycles, and while it could be labor-intensive, it was never chaotic. Days flowed predictably, like water over smooth stones. Farming itself was methodical. Fields were plowed, seeds scattered with care, irrigation channels maintained. Laborers coordinated their efforts quietly, observing the subtle shifts of the sun and river. Crops included wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables, with occasional livestock for supplement. Food was the reward for patience and repetitive effort. Each day's work, though physically demanding, had a meditative quality, a rhythm in which action, observation, and waiting coexisted. Even festivals tied to agriculture were gentle. Seasonal celebrations marked planting or harvest, offering thanks to gods and reinforcing social cohesion. Processions moved slowly, chants were repeated, and offerings distributed. It was communal, structured, and predictable, a soothing variation on the daily routine rather than a sudden burst of drama. Artisans and craftsmen contributed to this slow hum by producing tools, pottery, and household goods. Work was repetitive and deliberate, requiring attention and care. Scribes continued to record everything, from grain yields to labor assignments, maintaining the steady rhythm of administration. Nothing happened too fast, nothing demanded immediate panic. Just a steady, continuous effort perfectly aligned with the Nile's calm persistence. Children, of course, observed and learned. They assisted in small ways on farms, helped in workshops, or quietly studied rituals. Play was simple, repetitive, and intertwined with learning. They practiced basic skills, watched adults perform repetitive tasks, and absorbed the slow rhythm of life, preparing for their own eventual responsibilities. Health and diet remained consistent, gently punctuating daily activity. Meals of bread, vegetables, and occasional fish or meat were predictable and adequate. Minor ailments, injuries, and discomforts were treated methodically with herbs, poultices, and rest. Life was neither dramatic nor dangerous for most. It was steady, repetitive, and shaped by patience and endurance. Even governance operated on the same slow, methodical principle. Officials managed taxation, labor, and resource allocation with careful records, ensuring society flowed like the Nile itself, calm,
continuous, and predictable. Minor frustrations arose, miscounted grain or a delayed report, but these were handled quietly, without disruption. The rhythm of administration matched the rhythm of work, ritual, and domestic life, creating a continuous soothing pattern across the land. Religion, festivals, art, funerals, labor, and daily domestic life all contributed to this meditative tempo. Ancient Egyptians experienced a world of repetition, gentle variation, and predictable routines. Life was structured, continuous, and mildly quirky. Pharaohs, children, artisans, and laborers alike participated in a flow of activity that was steady, enduring, and quietly fascinating, perfect for a slow, sleepy reflection on history. So, as we bring this journey to a close, imagine the final gentle scenes. The Nile flowing under a setting sun, farmers finishing their work, children playing quietly in courtyards, priests chanting in temples, artisans chiseling the last marks on stone, and families preparing modest meals. Life in ancient Egypt was challenging, yes, but also calm, rhythmic, and enduring. Every repetition, minor quirk, and ceremonial chant contributed to a slow, continuous flow of civilization. And with that, dear historians, we leave the mud brick homes, sunlit fields, gently flowing Nile, and quiet temples behind. You can drift into sleep imagining the steady heartbeat of one of the oldest civilizations, slow, deliberate, and endlessly repetitive, yet strangely comforting in its gentle order. Good night.